For most of his life, Thomas Carter never believed in miracles. But the night he finally whispered a prayer he never imagined saying, something happened that changed everything. What followed would become a story his family would never forget, a moment many would call a miracle of the Virgin Mary. But before we go on, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thomas Carter was 52 years old. You know the type of man I'm talking about. The kind who wakes up at 5:30 every morning without an alarm. The kind who keeps his promises no matter what. For 30 years, Thomas had lived that way. Before the sun ever touched the horizon, he was already standing at the construction site. Hard hat on, boots coated in dust from 1,000 workdays. His workers respected him, not because he shouted orders. In fact, he rarely raised his voice. They respected him because of the quiet way he carried himself, and because every Friday, without fail, he paid his men personally, cash in envelopes, hand to hand, looking each one straight in the eyes. Good job this week, Marcus. How's your boy feeling now, Robert? Still sick? Small things like that. The kinds of gestures that turn a boss into someone people trust. Thomas had been married to Catherine for 28 years. And despite everything time had changed, one tradition remained untouched. Every Saturday morning, Thomas still woke up first. He made coffee. Then he waited. Soon Catherine would come downstairs, still in her robe, and they would sit together at the kitchen table. No phones, no television, just the two of them talking about the week. They had 2 children. Brandon, 24, already working as a civil engineer. Ashley, 21, finishing her degree in architecture. A good family. A steady family. Sunday dinners were sacred in their house. No matter how busy the week had been, Sunday evening meant everyone around the table. They talked about everything. Work, school, politics, sports. Sometimes they argued. Thomas and Brandon had more than one heated debate about construction techniques. But by the end of the night, peace always returned. Thomas believed something simple about family. You don't stay together because you never fight. You stay together because you always come back. Catherine was deeply Catholic. In the corner of the living room stood a small home altar. On it was an old image of the Virgin Mary, passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. Every night before bed, Catherine knelt there and prayed. Thomas wasn't particularly religious. He believed in God in his own quiet way. Practical, reserved, but he respected Catherine's faith. Sometimes, when he passed the altar, he made the sign of the cross, more out of habit than devotion. Their life was stable, predictable. Catherine often talked about the future, about traveling when Thomas finally retired. Ireland, she would say. I want to see where my grandparents came from. There was always a future waiting for them. Until one day, there wasn't. It started in March. At first it was just fatigue, but not the normal kind. Not the tiredness that comes after a long day at work. This was different. Thomas woke up exhausted. Even after sleeping. Even after coffee. Even after resting. Must be getting old, he joked one morning. But Catherine noticed more than he did. Little things. Small pauses halfway up the stairs. Thomas stopping for a moment. One hand gripping the railing. Taking a breath. Then continuing as if nothing had happened. One night, Catherine woke up at 3 a.m. Thomas wasn't in bed. She found him sitting on the edge of it. Hand pressed against his chest. Breathing slowly. Thomas. He forced a smile. Just heartburn. Go back to sleep. But Catherine knew. It wasn't heartburn. A few days later, the truth began to show. Thomas was at the construction site when the pain struck again. This time stronger. He had to lean against a concrete column just to stay standing. Marcus, a worker who had been with him for 15 years, saw it immediately. Boss, you need a doctor. Thomas shook his head. Doctors are for weak people. Marcus crossed his arms. Doctors are for people who want to stay alive. Thomas looked at him. Marcus continued calmly. Either you make the appointment, or I call Catherine and tell her you almost collapsed today. Thomas sighed, and finally gave in. Thursday came. The tests began. X-rays, CT scans, MRIs. Just to be thorough, the doctor said. But when doctors order 3 different scans, you know something isn't right. The following Tuesday, the phone rang. Dr. Harrison's voice sounded controlled. Careful. Mr. Carter, your results are ready. I'd like to discuss them in person tomorrow at 9. A pause. And please bring your wife. Thomas felt the ground vanish beneath him. Because when a doctor asks you to bring your wife, You already know. He hung up slowly. For a long time, he simply stared at the phone. Upstairs, he could hear Catherine humming softly. He walked up the stairs and found her folding clothes. She looked up. Who was it? Dr. Harrison. She froze. He wants to see us tomorrow. You too. The shirt slipped from her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. That night, Thomas heard her crying quietly in the bathroom. When she returned to bed, he pretended to be asleep. The next morning, they sat in Dr. Harrison's office. Catherine held Thomas's hand tightly. The doctor sat across from them, took a slow breath. You can always tell when someone is about to say something difficult. They prepare their words carefully. The test showed a serious condition. Very serious. Already advanced. Thomas felt like he was underwater. The doctor's voice sounded distant, distorted. Catherine's fingers tightened around his. Are there treatments? She asked. Yes, the doctor said carefully. But I need to be honest. Thomas interrupted. How long? Dr. Harrison hesitated. With treatment, 6 months. A year, if the response is very good. Thomas nodded slowly. And without treatment? The doctor's voice dropped. Weeks. Maybe a few months. Catherine began to cry, her shoulders trembling quietly. The walk back to the car was silent. At a red light, Catherine finally spoke. We're going to fight this. Thomas turned toward her. Okay. We're doing the treatment. It's going to work. Thomas nodded, even though deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it. That night they called Brandon and Ashley. Thomas didn't hide anything. He told them everything. Ashley burst into tears immediately. Brandon stayed silent for a long time. Then suddenly he looked up, tears running down his face. Ashley hugged her father tightly. You're going to be okay. You have to be. The following months were the hardest of their lives. And Thomas Carter, the man who had spent 52 years believing only in work, effort, and reality, was about to face something he had never considered before. Hope. The months that followed were brutal. Treatments, hospitals, doctors, medications that promised hope but often seemed to take more than they gave. Thomas kept fighting, not because he believed the treatments would save him, but because Catherine needed to see him fight. Because Brandon and Ashley needed to know their father never gave up. So he endured it all. But slowly, his body began to lose the battle. He lost weight. He lost strength. And the endless energy that had carried him through decades of construction work simply disappeared. Hospital visits became more frequent. And eventually the doctors began using softer words. Careful words. Words like palliative care. Words like keeping you comfortable. Brandon and Ashley came every day. They sat beside their father's bed, talking about normal things. Work, college, old family memories. They tried to keep everything feeling normal. But everyone knew the truth. Everyone. Catherine prayed constantly. Every night, she knelt before the small image of the Virgin Mary on the altar in their living room. Sometimes she stayed there for hours. Her voice barely more than a whisper. Please, just give him more time. Just a little more. Thomas saw it. He pretended to be asleep when she prayed. But he saw. And somehow, that hurt more than the illness itself. In October, Thomas was admitted to the hospital one final time. The room was small. White walls. That sterile hospital smell that never quite disappears. Catherine practically lived there. She slept in the armchair beside his bed, a blanket around her shoulders, never leaving for long. One Tuesday afternoon, the doctors asked Catherine to step into the hallway. Their voices were gentle, but direct. We should begin discussing the next steps when the time comes. Catherine understood immediately. She nodded, held herself together. But later, alone in the hospital bathroom, she collapsed. Tears she had been holding back for months finally broke free. Thursday night was especially difficult. The pain broke through even the strongest medication. Each breath Thomas took looked like hard work. Catherine sat beside him as always. Brandon and Ashley had stepped out for a few minutes. That was when Thomas opened his eyes. For the first time in days. They were clear, focused, alive. Catherine, I'm here, she answered instantly. Thomas looked at her carefully. Really looked. I'm scared. The words seemed to drain what little strength he had left. Catherine squeezed his hand. I know, my love. I know. Thomas shook his head slightly. I'm not afraid of what comes after. He struggled for breath. I'm afraid of leaving you. Catherine's voice trembled. We'll be okay. You taught us how to be strong. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, then suddenly opened them again. There was urgency now. Catherine. The image. She leaned closer. What image? The Virgin Mary. The one your mother gave you. Catherine blinked in surprise. In 28 years, Thomas had never asked for anything like that. You want me to bring it? Thomas nodded slowly. Please. I want her here with me. Catherine felt something tighten deep in her chest. I'll be back in an hour. She rushed home, up the stairs, into the living room. She took the small statue of the Virgin Mary from the altar. It fit in the palm of her hand. A simple plaster image. The blue mantle faded with time, worn by generations of prayer. Catherine knelt there for a moment holding it. Most Holy Mother, please take care of him. Even if you cannot heal him, please don't let him suffer. Don't let him be afraid. She hurried back to the hospital. When she arrived, Brandon was waiting in the hallway, his face pale. Mom, you need to go in. Dad's getting worse. Catherine rushed into the room. Dr. Walsh stood beside the bed, checking the monitors. He looked at her gently. It's close. Maybe a few hours. The world seemed to spin around her. Catherine walked to the bed. She took the small statue from her purse. Carefully, she placed it into Thomas's hand. She's here, she whispered near his ear. Just like you asked. Thomas's fingers tightened slightly around the image. And then, something strange happened. A scent. Roses. Soft. Fresh. Impossible to miss. Catherine looked around the room. There were no flowers. No perfume. Nothing that could explain it. But the scent filled the air. Gentle, but unmistakable. Do you smell it? She asked Brandon quietly. He inhaled. His eyes widened. Yes. Where is it coming from? Catherine looked down at the statue in Thomas's hands. A nurse entered the room. She stopped immediately. Did someone bring flowers? No, Catherine said softly. The nurse looked confused. Checked the monitors. Then quietly left the room. But the fragrance remained. All through the night. That impossible scent of roses filled the hospital room. And something else began to change. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas's breathing began to stabilize. Not suddenly, but gradually. Calmly. The nurse noticed. And when morning came, Thomas was still alive. Ashley arrived at 7 in the morning expecting the worst. Instead, she found her mother sitting beside the bed. Thomas sleeping. Peaceful. The next few days confused everyone. His vital signs remained stable. His breathing improved. Dr. Walsh ordered new tests. He stared at the results in disbelief. This doesn't make sense. All the indicators showed rapid decline. Now everything is stable. On the 3rd day, Thomas opened his eyes. Catherine was sitting beside him reading. Brandon noticed first. Mom, look. Thomas was staring back at them. Awake. Present. Alive. Hi, he whispered. Catherine grabbed his hand. You're back. Thomas smiled faintly. I never left. I was just far away for a while. Everyone laughed. Through tears. Through relief. Through disbelief. Dr. Walsh examined Thomas again. More scans were ordered. The medical team studied the results carefully. The disease hadn't disappeared. But something had changed. It had stopped progressing. Some indicators had even improved. Spontaneous remission, Dr. Walsh finally said. Though he didn't sound certain. It's extremely rare. Sometimes the body responds in ways we don't understand. Catherine asked the only question that mattered. Will he be okay? The doctor nodded slowly. If this stability continues, he has time. Months. Maybe more. Only days earlier. They had said hours. 3 weeks later, Thomas was discharged. Still weak. Still in a wheelchair. But alive. Fully conscious. Still here. The first thing he asked to do when they arrived home was go to Catherine's altar. I want to put her back, he said quietly. He gently returned the small statue of the Virgin Mary to its place. Thomas stood there for a long time, then finally spoke. I don't know if it was her. I don't know if my body is just stubborn. But when I asked, something changed, and I'm still here. Catherine placed her hand on his shoulder. Sometimes we don't need to understand. We just need to be grateful. The following months were different. Thomas didn't return to construction work. Instead, he spent his days in the backyard, listening to birds, to distant voices, to the quiet sounds of ordinary life. Things he had once ignored now felt sacred. Catherine often watched him through the kitchen window, smiling, the kind of smile that knows the value of one more day. She continued her prayers. Sometimes Thomas joined her. Brandon and Ashley still came every Sunday for dinner. Now every meal felt like a gift. One evening, Ashley asked something that had been on her mind. Dad, why did you ask for the image of the Virgin Mary that night? Ashley finally asked the question that had been on her mind. Dad, why did you ask for the image of the Virgin Mary that night? You were never really religious. Thomas thought about it for a long moment. Then he answered quietly, because when you reach your darkest moment, hope is the only thing you have left. He paused. And faith isn't about being completely sure. It's about trusting that maybe, just maybe, you're not alone. 6 months later, Thomas returned to the hospital for more tests. Dr. Walsh studied the results carefully. Then he looked up, clearly surprised. Everything was still stable. Some indicators had even improved. Statistically speaking, Dr. Walsh said slowly, "You shouldn't be here." Thomas smiled. "Well, I've always liked being the exception." 1 year after the night when doctors had given him only hours to live, Thomas sat in the backyard on a quiet autumn afternoon. Inside the house, Catherine was making coffee. Brandon would arrive soon for Sunday dinner. Ashley was bringing some of her latest architectural designs to show everyone. It was an ordinary day, but now Thomas knew something he hadn't understood before. Ordinary days are precious. He thought back to that night in the hospital. The pain, the fear, the moment he asked for the image of the Virgin Mary, the scent of roses, the sudden change that no doctor could explain. Was it a miracle? Thomas believed it was, because he had been given something priceless. Time. Time to see Ashley graduate. Time to watch Brandon get married. Time for more Saturday mornings with Catherine and a cup of coffee in the kitchen. Time to simply live. You know, there are people who spend their entire lives searching for signs, searching for reasons to believe. And there are others who live surrounded by miracles every day and never see them. Thomas had always been practical, a man who trusted only what he could touch with his hands. Concrete, steel, hard work. But that night in the hospital, when everything else had failed, he did something he had never done before. He asked for help, not from doctors, not from science, but from something greater. And somehow, someone answered. How? No one knows. Doctors call it spontaneous remission. Thomas's family calls it something else. They call it the miracle of the Virgin Mary. Because sometimes miracles aren't instant healings that defy every law of nature. Sometimes miracles look different. Sometimes they are simply a second chance, a little more time, a moment borrowed from the inevitable. Sometimes the miracle is waking up one more morning and realizing you're still here, still breathing, still loving, still alive. Thomas didn't waste that gift. He began living differently. He noticed things he had ignored before. Breakfast with Catherine, sunsets over the backyard fence, the laughter of his children during Sunday dinners. Every moment felt sacred now, because he understood how close he had come to losing it all. Catherine still prays every night before the small image of the Virgin Mary, just like she always has. But now Thomas sometimes kneels beside her, not with long prayers, not with memorized words, just with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispers, "for one more day." The little statue of the Virgin Mary still stands on the altar, quiet, peaceful, holding the faith of 3 generations of women. And now, the faith of one man who learned to believe when everything else had failed. Thomas's life isn't perfect now. He still has difficult days. He still goes to regular checkups. He still carries the fragile awareness of someone who once stood at the edge of everything. But he's here. And sometimes, that's the greatest miracle of all. Because in the end, it doesn't matter what you call it. A miracle, spontaneous remission, luck, coincidence. What matters is this. When Thomas Carter reached his darkest moment, he asked for help, and someone answered. And if that's not a reason to believe, then what is? Catherine often says something now. Faith doesn't remove the storms. It gives you the strength to walk through them. Thomas knows that's true. The storm didn't disappear overnight, but he was given the strength to endure it. And on the other side of that storm, he found something he thought he had lost forever. Not just health, not just more time, but purpose. The certainty that even when everything feels hopeless, it's still worth asking for help, still worth believing, still worth hoping that maybe we are not alone in this vast and mysterious world. And you, how many times in your life has something happened that you couldn't explain? How many times has something impossible happened exactly when you needed it most? Maybe it was a sudden change of direction. Maybe it was that strange feeling telling you to call someone. And when you did, you discovered that person needed you more than you could have imagined. Maybe it was a moment when everything seemed lost. Yet somehow, you kept going. Life is full of small miracles, small interventions, quiet moments when the impossible becomes real. And sometimes all we have to do is ask, just like Thomas did that Thursday night. Please, I need help. 3 simple words, but powerful enough to change everything. And if you've made it this far, if you've listened to the entire story of Thomas and Catherine, then do one thing for me. Write in the comments, "She heard," because that's exactly what happened. And every time I see those words in the comments, I'll know that one more person believes that miracles still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Share in the comments a miracle you have witnessed or experienced. And share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue to bless and protect you and your family. Amen.